Now we move on to our final topic of our discussion, which is ecotourism. And an American Express study in 2015 showed that 66% of all international travelers were interested in traveling to a nature-based area. Nature tourism today generates as much as $600 billion annually in revenues. However, less than $10 billion is spent globally in conserving these ecotourism sites. How should emerging market governments, and to a greater extent developed markets as well, increase awareness and set up guardrails to minimize the carbon footprint left by tourists on such sites?
It's a great topic. We actually, so at the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise, we established a program, I think it's now 2-3 years ago, I've lost track, called the Sustainable Tourism Asset Management Program, or STAMP, right? So I always like to think of a passport, STAMP. It's focused on sustainability in tourism. I'm not going to say ecotourism because I think it's broader than that. The real foundation of that program is saying there is a hidden cost to tourism that localities, destinations, regional governments, national governments, even international tourism organizations do not factor in to tourism, right? So there's this whole hidden side, and we call these the invisible burden of tourism. We put out a report this past February called Hidden Costs, the Invisible Burden of Tourism, which is available online for free download. And basically what it's saying is, we've all seen in one place or another some of the impacts of over-tourism that are coming in, the amount of pressure being put on destinations and regions from the sheer influx of tourists into an area that quickly gets overwhelmed from an infrastructure standpoint. They don't have the energy to support the energy demand that the tourists bring in. They don't have the infrastructure to support the transportation needs. They don't have it to support the waste management. The water infrastructure is not there. And the people who suffer the most are the people that are living in those regions in the first place that get overwhelmed by the tourism. And that's just as true of any urban area in a developed country as it is about the most remote destination that you might be talking about in an emerging economy. And so this is really about looking at two things. Those hidden costs, and tying those into exacerbating this is the threat of climate change, which threatens those destinations in a very, very particular way over time, in terms of so many of our tourist destinations are sensitive to ecological change. And their cultural, historical assets are threatened by sea level rise, storms, drought, all the extreme weather that a changing climate can bring to bear. And so that's the economic foundation on which the tourism industry, which has been growing so much over the last decade, depends upon. If we continue as business as usual, if our approach to tourism, which for the most part it is to set up national tourism boards, national tourism organizations, whose main, if not sole, charge is to increase the number of tourists coming into a country by increasing the branding and marketing activity. So they are simply judged on effectiveness of branding and marketing by definition of the number of tourists that come into a place, domestic or international. If that's the model that we will continue to use, these tourist destinations are in big trouble. And so real sustainable tourism is not necessarily ecotourism. It is about thinking about supply and demand. There is a limited supply. We have destinations. We can bring more destinations online, but any given destination, there is going to be what we can call a carrying capacity of that destination in terms of the infrastructure it has. We can make investments in the infrastructure. We can increase it so that we can increase the carrying capacity, but it's not infinite and it's not unlimited. We have to think about the energy needs, the water needs, the waste needs, and other social, historical, cultural, ecological elements in those destinations that have to be managed. Our argument is you have to bring management into it. You have to bring managerial decision making about limited resources, limits on supply, limits on demand, find ways to deliver the supply you have to the demand you want, equalize those from an economic perspective, but not simply manage to tourism numbers. You have to take a much more complex approach to it. The issue is, like I said, these tourism boards are mostly filled with marketing people. So they're not equipped to do the kinds of things we're talking about. That portfolio has to be expanded in terms of the portfolio of human resources and the skills. The tools that need to be used to manage these places need to be expanded. It's not enough simply to look and say numbers coming in are going up, we're okay. You have to use tools like GIS, you have to use full cost accounting, you have to bring other financial tools to bear. How do you bring money in so that it can be reinvested in the place? No business would let its best cash cow, the thing that's generating the most revenue, would simply stop investing in that over time and milk it for the money and not invest it. I mean, businesses will do it, but those businesses don't last. Those always fail. And so you, as a country, you want to look at your destinations and you want to reinvest money to make sure that asset is healthy. Because today's tourists, as you're saying, they want to go somewhere that is unique. They want to experience. They're expecting it to be ecologically sound. They want it to be safe and secure, and that doesn't mean filled with police and army trying to keep back the population. That's not an authentic experience. So any place that is managing its tourist destinations simply by trying to create some bubble that as many tourists can experience as possible while keeping everything else out is doomed. We need a much more rigorous managerial approach to it, and that would be true sustainable tourism.
And now that you were talking about like these vulnerable areas for tourism, I was thinking of this beach in Thailand that closed due to the excess of tourism that they were having. And I'm also thinking about the Tayrona Park in Colombia. It's a beautiful site on the Caribbean coast, and the indigenous people ask the national parks to close and let the ecosystem regenerate.
Yep.
So it's like this connection that people, the communities have with their ecosystems and with their region, with their areas, and they try to conserve what they have, like leave the space how it is.
Yeah, oh, I think this gets back to that idea of community, government, business, and I'm not talking about necessarily large multinationals. I'm talking about the private sector community and everything from the startup, local entrepreneur, all the way to the national and international firms, really getting together and saying, from an opportunity perspective, a strategic perspective, what do we want this area, this region, this country to look like? How do we manage to that? How do we put the programs and policies in place that are going to be consistent with encouraging that? Mm-hmm. Of course, oftentimes when we're talking about sustainability in tourism, Costa Rica is held up as a model because that's really, for all the pros and cons that Costa Rica has, I think one of the things that we can all learn from it is when a country sets out a national policy and decides this is the vision, we're going to work towards that, it bears fruit. They make an investment and that pays off. When countries go the other way and there's no regulation, it's just about having as many tourists can come through, you end up in situations like Thailand. But Thailand's not the only one, right? I've seen it in the Philippines, I've seen it in Indonesia. You see this all around the world where there's just unfettered access, exacerbated these days by social media. Everybody wants to go where they saw their influencer go. Everybody wants to travel on the same TripAdvisor itinerary. It's untenable. We can't keep that up. And it's not an either-or decision. There's better management tools and techniques that are out there. We have more information about the ecology and how to preserve social and historical and cultural assets. Why we're not using that is beyond me. It's good management, and everybody should be employing it.
Interesting. So, to the example of Costa Rica, there's another country, Bhutan, listed in the Himalayas. So they control a tourist. So if you're a tourist in Bhutan, the only way you can get a visa there to visit is go to the government, say that I'm going to stay for 7 days. Right? For all those 7 days, the government will plan your itinerary. The government will plan where you stay. You have to pay the government a fixed fee for every day you stay.
Yep.
And that fee will cover all your expenses, your lodging, your boarding, your internal travel, and your fees for all the parks and forests that you see. It's a very well managed system, and there are predetermined slots, predetermined periods on when you can apply to that visa, and there are capacity limits on how many people can go there.
Right.
So this has helped them become the only country which is a carbon sink in the whole world.
It's a demand management approach,
Exactly.
right?
I mean, because there are different ways to do that. There are possibly techniques, but you have, I mean, basically put your finger on one of the things is that the awareness and also the political willingness to tackle these issues. And you mentioned tourism boards. There is an issue which is about training also the officials in these boards, so that you can have a vision, you can have the ideas, but it needs to be trickling down and be actually implemented at the field level. And that's also one of the problems which we can encounter in trying to maintain tourism heritage or how would you reserves or your. How do you call patrimoine? I mean, what's basically what belongs to your country,
right.
Your historical heritage.
Yeah.
There is a matter of awareness, there is a matter of training, there is a matter of basically actually implementing at the local level. And that's sometimes where the difficulty is.
Yeah, and I've been in this space now for 30 years, and it certainly predates me. But the argument that I've heard for 30 years that I still can't believe gets made with seriousness is this idea that we have a choice of X or Y. You know, we either have to let these areas develop and gain economic growth and economic development, or we're kind of stuck in the Stone Age in some way. Or if we go green, or we do think that is sacrificing jobs and that's sacrificing. It's such a silly argument these days. I can't believe it still gets made and people accept it just on face value. It's ridiculous. There's too many examples out there. I don't know that every country should do what Costa Rica does or what Bhutan does, but I think what it illustrates is there are choices and options people have, and it's incumbent upon anybody in a leadership role or a decision-making role, and I don't think you have to be elected or you have to be a CEO to be in that role. You can be a community member with a vested interest in your local ecology and your local community. You have just as much of a leadership role to play as well. Should be asking a better set of questions, looking at what the different things out there are, benchmarking and seeing what other people have done, and then designing something more complex for yourself locally. And I'm not saying complex from the standpoint that it can't be managed, but complex and nuanced given the tools that we have to be able to do that today. You can create a different option for yourself, for your community, than simply, we must have this tourism, or we can't develop, or we can't have anything and we have to stay untouched and pristine. There are better ways to do things, and demand management is one of those things. You can look in the tourism field, some people will say imposing a tourism tax or a tourism fee will inhibit the growth of the tourism economy. That's ridiculous. There are plenty of examples out there. New Zealand is one of them. Iceland is another, where they've imposed fees on a national level, and tourism has continued to grow over time. So, because those fees are not somehow inhibitive for the tourists. There have been studies done by the OECD that have looked and said, if you put this much, if you start to bring in the kind of investment you need into this region, you're talking about anywhere from less than $10 US up to maybe $40 US per tourist per trip that would be required in order to create the financial foundation to invest in the destination and maintain it over time. That is not overly inhibitive. Your airline fees alone these days, for reasons I still have no idea why I've got $120 on a $200 ticket of airline fee. I'm accepting that. I believe in action proves out in the marketplace. Tourists will accept those fees if they see that investment going where it should go.
Are there examples of countries, which would have some sort of a best practice or which would do better than the others? You mentioned Australia, or which country?
New Zealand. I think New Zealand has done some interesting.
Australia, no.
Australia has done some interesting things. Iceland has done some interesting things. Spain has done some interesting things. Costa Rica. I think there's a lot of examples. I've spent time in Indonesia and the Philippines. both countries have got serious issues with tourism. In fact, the Philippines, their Minister of Environment has shut down a few places over time because the environmental degradation has become so bad. That said, there are other places that they've been experimenting with different ways of tourism fees and things like that. And if fees and taxes aren't the way that a particular place wants to go, let's look at conservation financing. Let's look at green bonds. Let's look at social bonds. There's other financial mechanisms out there that people are experimenting with. I don't know that any one of them is the right thing for any one location, but this is where leaders and folks that are really interested in these issues ought to be investing time and effort to try to see, let's experiment, let's see what can work for us, and let's put those programs and policies in place to encourage the future we want to see, and not just accept business as usual as the future we have to have.
Yeah, interesting. So this was a very healthy debate on how ecotourism can be managed to ensure that tourists don't end up damaging these diverse sites. And I would definitely encourage all our viewers to go and read that report that Professor Mark was talking about. It's available on the website for free, right?
Yeah, it's available at, I wish I could remember where it is. If you go to the travelfoundation.org, they're the entity that we worked on with it that is publishing it. You can find the link there. And there is a direct link, but it's not coming to me off the top of my head.
Awesome. I'm sure that'll be an interesting read given our current discussion.
I hope people will find it that way.